Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give it a minute as our audience joins. Okay, I'm going to start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for today's unique webinar. My name is Rania Saadawi and I am the Executive Director at the Pearl Initiative. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual panel today on anti-corruption best practices, focusing on using digitization as a tool for good governance and corruption prevention in the private sector. Before we begin, I'd like to start by first introducing the Pearl Initiative briefly. The Pearl Initiative is the Gulf region's leading independent nonprofit organization working to improve corporate accountability and transparency across the private sector, across family firms, small businesses, tech startups, and philanthropic organizations in the Gulf region. We were established 10 years ago by regional business leaders for businesses and the private sector in the Gulf region, and in partnership with the United Nations Office for Partnerships. More recently, the Pearl Initiative is one of the few organizations in the Gulf region to receive special consultative status from the United Nations Economic and Social Council. The Pearl Initiative runs programs focusing on governance-related matters. We conduct regionally based research. We convene business leaders, government and civil society leaders, as well as future business leaders or students, to discuss challenges and opportunities in implementing best practices in the workforce. We also run workshops and trainings in partnerships with other organizations to support business professionals as they take the lead in implementing corporate governance, accountability, and transparency practices in their organizations. Through our flagship program, our Anti-Corruption Best Practices program, we have collaborated in close partnership with our corporate partner, STC, on a series of webinars and discussions on various aspects of anti-corruption and ethics practices across the private sector. Today, we're here to discuss digitization specifically as a tool used to improve good governance and anti-corruption standards in the Gulf region. The goal of today's panel discussion is to really empower you, owners and business leads of Gulf-based businesses, particularly small businesses and MSMEs, that are facing economic challenges and also looking to build their resilience, improve their integrity and transparency by implementing good corporate governance and anti-corruption best practices using digitization tools. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our moderator for today's session, Mr. Samer Itani. Samer has joined the Pearl Initiative as an expert on corporate governance, strategy, and risk management. He is a seasoned consultant with significant experience working with Deloitte and as a senior strategist specialist with Department of Energy and Water Authority in the UAE. Thank you, Samer, for moderating today's discussion.
Thank you.
Joining us today, our expert panelists today include Mr. Jalil Ghani, the General Manager for Corporate Ethics and Compliance at STC. Under Jalil's leadership in 2020, STC developed a new ethics and compliance program focused on elevating the culture of integrity within the large company. Prior to joining STC, Jalil has held extensive leadership positions in compliance across Saudi Arabia, including at SABIC and GE. More recently, Jalil was the deputy chair of the B20 Saudi Arabia Integrity and Compliance Task Force. Thank you, Jalil, for joining us on today's important discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us as well is Ms. Deborah Webster, the creator of Amani. Deborah operates at the nexus between technology and humanity, with a particular interest in the ethical and beneficial utilization of data, technology, and artificial intelligence. Deborah believes we need to get smarter on who and what we're backing, and a better way of doing business. Deborah is a trusted sounding board and jousting partner to investors and founders globally, as well as in the Gulf region, and she helps them to navigate the future preempt regulation, and build technology that serves humanity and drives the business forward. Thank you, Deborah, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us as well from Beirut is Mr. Arkan El-Siblani, the Regional Anti-Corruption Chief Technical Advisor at UNDP. Arkan is an international development professional specialized in supporting democratic governance reforms with a focus on anti-corruption and the rule of law. A lawyer by training, Mr. El-Siblani is currently leading UNDP's initiatives on anti-corruption and integrity practices across the Arab countries. Thank you, Arkan, for joining us today. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Charles Thomas joining us from the UK. Charles is the Director of Anti-Bribery and Corruption at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Charles is responsible for the product development, vision, and strategy of LexisNexis Anti-Bribery and Corruption Services, which helps companies to proactively manage their risks and exposure to prosecution by preventing risky company and employee activity. Charles is also instrumental in coordinating product positioning and go-to-market plans with the sales and marketing teams, working closely with both clients and internal stakeholders to create innovative new services that help clients manage their businesses and compliance risks more effectively. We really thank you, Charles, and all of our panelists for joining us today.
Thank you.
Before I hand it over to Samer to kick off our conversation, just a word of note to our audience. For many of you that have joined us in our sessions before, we aim to make our sessions as interactive as possible. So we encourage you to use the chat function and the Q&A function to send through your thoughts and questions throughout the session, and Samer will be fielding them during the session as well as during the dedicated Q&A portion of today's panel discussion. In addition, there will be polls that will be presented to all of you, and we encourage you to take the polls. These polls are anonymous, and it's just for us to gauge your understanding and where you are sitting in terms of your understanding and your belief in digitization and supporting anti-corruption and best practices. And with that, over to you, Samer.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you for this lovely introduction, and thank you for our panelists for joining us today. In the age of digitization, digital tools rely on different mechanisms, plans, and frameworks, which can drive corporate governance in MSMEs, build resilience within the business community, and enhance business operations. The panel discusses how digital transformation processes within businesses and how it can be adequately and equally governed to mitigate upon upcoming risks and reduce the opportunity for corruption. So the conversation today will also provide an overview of various digitization principles of anti-corruption measures, while also addressing their limitations, risks involved, and the factors that can contribute to, as well as that hinders its success. So through digitization, organization can improve internal systems to enhance transparency, allowing government bodies and their private sector to efficiently deliver services that prevent and eliminate corruption. So before we jump into the discussion today, let's kick off today's session with a quick poll question to our audience regarding the general understanding of digitization. So we can have these two questions here. So do you think that digitization can help eradicate corruption within organization? And how you can encounter corruption within our companies, if we have encountered corruption in our companies? I'll give it a minute for the answers. Okay, for the results, so if we, for the eradication of corruption within the organization, we have 73% that said yes, and 27% with the no answer as a result. And as for if we encountered any corruption within our companies, we have 82% which says no, and 18% saying yes. So this is how we'll see after the session. Okay. Thank you, and thank you for the results. So with that, I would like to kick off today's panel discussion with our first question. Maybe we'll ask it for Charles. So the Gulf countries in the recent years have taken significant steps towards digitization to ensure efficient services and data integrity and transparency. How do you think, in your opinion, can tech innovations and data analytics mitigate business risks, improve due diligence, and ensure regulatory compliance?
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. I think just the key word that you think you came up with there is efficiencies. One of the things that's happening as a trend across all due diligence and all compliance is there's so much more information. The burst of online access to information, the ever-growing amount of information that's available on third parties, on individuals, means that there's more to digest. Digitalization can actually be a tool to help you better digest and analyze that information. So whether it's externally facing, when you're conducting your due diligence on a new provider, for example, a new business partner, a new third party, there's more information. You can use digital tools to actually better analyze that information. But then secondly, once you've got that information, once you have your own information, once you have your own due diligence, I think too often that information is almost wasted. It's used as a binary decision-making tool. Do we want to do business with this third party? Yes or no? We gather our information. Once we've got our information, we assess it and we say, yes, we want to go ahead. We sign a contract, we have a relationship. Well, that's great. But there's a wealth of information in that process that could and should be used to better drive understanding of market opportunities, of business relationships, even commercial relationships. And I've seen one mining company who do a brilliant job of, they're a global mining company, they do a great job of taking their due diligence information and using it to assess their supply chain from a commercial perspective to drive better prices. So they do that by taking that information, using the analytics and using the data in a more effective way. So I think that's probably the key thing that can be done, is drive more efficiency into that data environment.
Thank you, Charles. Arkan, would you like to give us your opinion? Arkan.
Yes. Hi. I think it's important to at the outset to clarify what we mean. If we're talking about digital technologies and as a tool to tackle corruption, it's important to clarify the concept of corruption. Corruption being the abuse of entrusted power or authority for private gain. So if we look at corruption as being abuse of entrusted power that is entrusted to you as a public official, or even as an officer of a private company with shareholders, accountable to shareholders at the end of the day, you have been given the power to make decisions on behalf of citizens or shareholders, and therefore any abuse of that power for private gain is considered to be corruption. With that in mind, it is clear that over the recent years, a global consensus has emerged, and many examples have emerged of how actually technology can help in promoting anti-corruption. And it does that in two ways. The first is a direct way where it helps in the actual detection of corrupt practices. It's a direct approach to prevent and tackle corruption using digital tools to detect, analyze, investigate, even predict corruption trends. The second way is more of an indirect approach, is through promoting effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions, such as e-governance for effective service delivery, digital tools to promote advocacy and awareness, open data for monitoring and access to information, even for empowering citizens to engage and simplifying procedures and enabling governments to move forward towards a more citizen-centric approach to offering public services. So with that in mind, there's ample evidence that the technology and anti-corruption are mutually reinforcing. However, one cannot necessarily always draw a simple line of causality simply by saying that technology leads to anti-corruption, because there is also evidence that technology, if not properly governed and designed, can actually not only can it not contribute to anti-corruption, actually it can protect and foster corrupt practices. So it's very important to consider also what kind of solutions and how these solutions are governed, whether in the public sector or the private sector.
Thank you. That comes after with our question, like what are the challenges faced by organizations as they adapt and implement digital solutions, and how can governance practices address these challenges? If Deborah would like to answer
Thank
that.
you. I'm really glad Arkan brought up that point, because we live in a technologically obsessed world. And you can't tackle corruption if you don't look at the human factor and you don't look at processes. So there is some people just like to kind of jump to a solution and just, well, we're doing this, so we're doing well. But we're in danger of concretizing broken systems. So I think at this moment in time, we're at a great opportunity to look at where the systems are broken, redesign systems, and then implement digital solutions. If we don't do that, back to Arkan's point, we could actually cause more harm than good. And one of the things I always ask people to do is to fast forward in time. The purpose of business, other than, I think there's a shift in global markets about a shift from shareholder value and return to stakeholder return and value. And the future we're supposed to be creating is one where there's equal prosperity and leveling the playing field so everyone has an opportunity to thrive. And for the SMEs that are listening to this and the startups, it's really, really important, because it helps level the playing field for them in terms of opportunity. In this current reality, we have, sometimes some big players that have a lot more muscle, so to speak, to get their way, and so they can squeeze out smaller players. And I think one of the potential opportunities of technology used wisely and using wise governance practices is that we do level the playing field. I mean, that's very much part of the mantra of ESG, which is the environmental, societal, and governance aspects of companies. I hope that's helpful. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Deborah, for this insight. Jalil, would you tell us a little bit about the challenges and the governance practices?
Sure, and I think I think Deborah and Charles have touched on some of these. So I think from an organizational standpoint, I think a lot of us from a business standpoint are always we have drivers from a cost perspective. How do you drive cost efficiency within an organization? And typically look at cost efficient in terms of say, well, how do we digitize? And to what Deborah was mentioning as well, is it's really about the processes that you have. If you have a bad process and you digitize that process, and you should not be surprised when that process doesn't work. Digitization is an enabler, but that means you should have good and effective processes within your organization. But then when you do digitize, then what are the governance factors that you will have in place to ensure that there is oversight to prevent issues from occurring? And I think this was somewhat to what Charles was talking about earlier when he was talking about doing due diligence and having false positives. It's knowing what information to be looking out for, because once you've digitized, the process now changes, and you need to now look for what are the trends that are emerging within your organization. Are people trying to find loopholes to circumvent your process? So a very simple example, if you have a process where you have an approval for a 10,000 real, £10,000 limit, and people circumventing that, and by doing multiple transactions that are lower than 10,000 just to circumvent an approval. Again, they're using the technology that you have created and now enables them to actually bypass the process. So all of this, I think, from a governance perspective, I think as companies, we are all emerging, we are all learning, and I think the key for us all as for the business people is really to ensure that before we go into this digitization realm, is making sure that you have good, solid, smart processes that work, that are efficient, that you have the right controls in place. But also, once you do digitize, is constantly look back and say, well, are the controls that we have they evolved to reflect the business that we're in? And if they haven't evolved, then they should be looked at, on a continuous basis.
Samar, can I add something to Jamil's point there? Because there's the other component, which is making sure that leadership understands the importance of good governance. And it's not just a checkbox exercise, it's an opportunity to, it's a way of having a stable business. It's an opportunity to differentiate yourself from somebody else. But if leadership don't understand the importance, everything else is actually just a waste of time and money.
Thank you, Deborah. Adding more on Jalil, and taking the side on from the SME side, which is when small businesses and startups often build their business operations based on trust and informality, which is within the current time. For successful startups, actually, they tend to grow exponentially. However, without the right alignment of governance structures. So the decisions that are not properly reported often lead to conflict and prevalence of the anti-corruption within the working culture. Jalil, again, how can SMEs specifically adopt sound corporate governance practices and internal control systems to support digitization?
I think that's going to be a good question for Deborah to be asking as well. So I think on that particular point, I think, when you have these startup and small companies, I think the culture of compliance really comes from the founders. They set the values for the organization. They set the expectations for what the employees should actually be doing. And like you say, these companies are going to be growing exponentially. The policies probably are not going to be reflecting that growth because the company is growing so fast, and the focus is on the bottom line, not on policies, not on governance. And then the leaders are going to really be the people setting the tone for the organization. And those leaders, and I think it goes back to the point that Deborah said about leadership, it's for them to understand that it is not what they say, it's what they do in their behavior that reflects the culture of the organization. So they should not be surprised if the employees start taking shortcuts because of something that they have said as leaders, have done as leaders, because they have what's created the culture. So to your point is that, creating that governance environment, yes, you can do that once you're established, but like you said, for these small startups, the emphasis really needs to be on those leaders to make sure that they walk the talk from day one, and they set the expectation of what does that company stand for. Because at those early stages, if a crack does appear in the foundation, as that company grows, those cracks are going to get bigger and bigger, and there's going to be an issue. And that startup, unfortunately, is not going to be a sustainable startup, because at some point something will come back down and it will bite them, unfortunately.
Thank you, Jalil. Deborah, or anyone would like to give us his opinion?
I'm so glad Jalil said that, so thank you. It's founders and investors, and it's funny because a lot of these things are symptomatic. So for instance, one of the big telltale signs is, look at the example of a founder or founders that set up with this grandiose purpose and this great mission and everything else, but then they want to raise capital. And so they're just desperate to bring investors on board, and investors start to push them on particular issues, and they start to acquiesce. For me, as soon as someone starts to acquiesce, that is actually an orange flag. It's not a red flag yet, but if someone is willing, it depends on what they're acquiescing on, but it shows that a state of corruptibility. And I don't mean in terms of you're currently corrupt. It means that you are susceptible to acquiescing to your principles based on what those around you of influence will do. So if you're willing to do that with an investor, you're likely to do that with a client as well. And then and back to Jalil's point, that's the tone is set from the top. So if you reward that kind of behavior, then that is actually the culture that you'll embed into the organization, and then you've got a toxic culture. So there's no point in saying, you know, this is what we stand for, but actually this is what we reward in practice. Is what you reward in practice that gets replicated. Yeah,
and if I just jump in on that what you do in practice piece is brilliantly observed. Perhaps best noted from Enron. If you'll remember Enron had some of the best compliance policies of any company I've ever read. They were fantastic. Their policies and everything they laid out was very detailed, very ethical, very correct. They just didn't necessarily put any of it into practice. So exactly to Jalil and Deborah's point there, that you can say these things, but you actually have to put them into practice. There's been some excellent work recently done by Transparency International on the effectiveness of compliance programs, not just whether you've got one, but how effective it actually is. I think that's a whole part of it. So back to Jalil's point, if you're going to go down this route of digitization, startup, speed of growth, if you start properly and make it effective properly, then that can grow with you. If, I think Deborah raising the point of almost the entrepreneurial nature of some people in the startup environment, leads to maybe cutting corners, maybe looking, I think I like the idea of acquiescing your principles, maybe letting your guard down a bit because you've got to grow quickly, because we've got to be the next unicorn. That's not effective. So it's all well and good having the policies and procedures, but they've actually got to do something with them.
Sure. And if I could just build on that as well, I think, you know, not just, you know, you mentioned the example of Enron, but if you look at any of the MNCs that have got into trouble, they all have the key elements of a compliance program. And the question is, it's not about having a program, it's do you have the culture? Because again, without, you know, you can have the best policies and procedures in the world, but if your people don't understand them, don't read them, are not made aware, then really no point in having the policy. And that's, I think that's even in the compliance world, and, you know, we're slightly digressing, but that's really where, you know, organizations are trying to move away from a compliance culture where they talk about having the, you know, more focus towards integrity than compliance, and more focus on the culture. And you are seeing that in more of the, you know, more of the cases and judgments coming through. But really, that's where the emphasis really needs to be from within the organization, is not focus too much on the policy, the procedure. You know, yes, that they are important, but at the same time as well, so is an understanding and awareness of what the rules are and why you have the rules. And, you know, if you have the latter, it goes a long, long way. The policy will only go so far.
If I may come in, Samer, also on these important points raised by the colleagues. I mean, maybe going back to the topic of technology and how it contributes to compliance, but even beyond compliance. I think in addition to the need to encourage innovation and the application of new technologies, there is an increasingly clear recognition that regulation is also necessary to govern the responsible use of technologies and data, and also kind of self-regulation within the private sector as well. Here, the importance of collective action, of setting advanced standards, it becomes very important. In addition to regulation, I think this is also, that's something that is missing or not necessarily complete in all countries in the region. The other element is really investments in digital infrastructure need to be in place in order to reap the benefits of new technologies. So again, if we are asking companies or public entities to resort to digitalization and digital services, digital solutions, also one needs to look at the infrastructure present in place as well. And that must be also accompanied by a strong political commitment on the government side, and also commitment within the leadership of companies to change existing systems, mechanisms, but also cultures. And I think that point has been raised by colleagues, going beyond you know, the process, the rules, the hard rules, but also looking at the culture. Also, it's important to it's important to build trust in technology, because again, it doesn't come natural to everyone to trust technology and resort to technology. So again, that's an area in the region that also needs to be considered. Maybe with the newer generation, it's not that much of a problem, but also the issue of trust in technology as well, how to build that trust. And here it's important participatory approaches to digital governance, including public engagement with clients, dialogue, consultation with wide range of stakeholders becomes very important in terms of designing your policies, but also the digital solutions that one needs to internalize or integrate in your own company or in government for that matter. So I just wanted to highlight these points to say that there is much to consider moving forward on this agenda.
Thank you, Erkan. Actually, there's a question as well that came up, which is interesting. As in, it's always like it is sophisticated to ask SMEs to go for corporate governance while they are in the need of many essential necessary issues like financials and financing and so on. So in other words, is it priority for them? Like, is corporate governance as in priority for them? It's open. It's an open question.
I can jump in there. You don't get bogged down with the terminology. Corporate governance is about good leadership. There's a big difference between a founder and being a CEO. And if you want to have a sustainable company, you've got to be a solid leader. And that goes with having a solid set of internal values and principles that you can propagate into your company and the people around you. It's all well and good to raise money, but at the end of the day, you've got to be able to deploy the capital. And if you are not an individual who can instill trust with a potential team, then you're never going to deploy the capital, or you will, and you'll burn it all. I see a lot of sentiment entitlement around founders, and I think we need to focus on transitioning founders to responsible CEOs. Break things fast is absolutely irresponsible. And back to Erkan's point, I think about trust in technology. I think we sometimes over-trust technology. We need to get better in the due diligence behind what the technology is doing, what data is being collected, what is being done with the data, what's being done with the insights of the data. I mean, the research shows that, a lot of people don't read terms and conditions and privacy policies, and understandably, because they would lose masses of hours. There was one research study that showed if you were to read all the terms and conditions of all the apps and websites that you use, you would need 67 days. So if technology is supposed to make us more efficient, it actually isn't at the end of the day, because we are abusing these very powerful tools. So we must have practices in place that reinstill trust in technology and the people behind it.
And this is when I'm going to throw in a Latin quote. I would like to thank my parents for teaching me Latin when I was growing up, and my teachers, but quis custodia ipsos custodes is a lovely old quote. Who guards the guards themselves? So Erkan's absolutely right that you need to have technology. Everyone's buying into the technology and digitalization of processes. Deborah's entirely right that you need to instill those as part of a good governance plan from the outset, because if you don't as a startup, then if you cut corners at the beginning, the corners just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the problems get bigger and bigger. I'm sitting here surrounded by snow. It's like a snowball. If you start small, it just rolls down the hill and get bigger. But that idea of who guards the guards themselves is that a lot of the companies and a lot of the market for digitization, for AI, cloud solutions are themselves startups. They are themselves very fast growing, technological, dynamic, exciting startups. That poses in itself a risk of engaging with a company with perhaps a small profile. Perhaps they haven't been around for very long. So there really is even more of an imperative, if you're going to work with someone and, to Erkan's point, trust someone and trust their technology, make sure you've done the due diligence on that provider to know that they're a good company to work with. Not just that they've got all the technological whiz bang and they can use all the wonderful buzzwords. Make sure you can trust the people you're working with behind the technology.
I think you're muted, Deborah.
I thought I pressed the button and I didn't. There you go. See, technology. But rather human error, and it's human error that I want to point on, and that is FOMO. It's a major hack because humans are being hacked all the time. People are influenced by the media. So, for instance, look at the Theranos case that's in court at the moment. Way back when, there was all this positive media around this amazing technology, about this amazing company, youngest female billionaire, yada, yada, yada. And all these investors followed suit, and no one actually had done proper due diligence. So we need to be cognizant that us as human beings, we can be very easily hacked, and understanding how we can be hacked, because ultimately that's our decision-making processes, and being more aware as to how we can be hacked, and then you integrate that into technology. I think that makes for a very smart combination, because you've got to remember it's humans working in sync with technology. It's not just technology on its own, because otherwise we are subcontracting our decision-making to technology. And currently the data on this is petrifying. So for instance, there was a survey of senior executives that were asked that seen the benefit of AI and creating positive results in their company, but 65% of these executives that had experienced positive results in their company with the AI couldn't actually explain how the AI worked, how the algos made decisions. And so you're not making any decisions. It's crazy, very irresponsible. So that for me is very poor governance.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, so how can we address the misuse of technology by organized, if there's any organized crime, or without hindering the innovation and the value through that? Maybe Jalil would answer me.
I think it's the point of understanding well, you say understand the crime, but it's understanding what technology is out there and how you can use technology. I think it's back down to the basic fundamentals. Technology is an enabler. It's not the sole decision maker. And I think, again, that's going back down to basics. So, a simple example, we've talked about digitization. Now, many companies will say, we have an approval process that we have digitized. Well, what exactly have you digitized? Is it just the formal approval, or is it the entire process? Where is the decision making done? And again, it's understanding really what role technology plays in the overall process, and what is the criteria, the rationale used as part of that logic. And I go back early, like I said early on, Charles talked about due diligence, and he talked about false positives. When you use due diligence and you use somebody's name. But you can use technology to do that. But at the end of the day, somebody human needs to maybe read that and understand, is it relevant for the subject matter of what we're actually looking at? If you're going to have logic that says that if your company or a company name is associated with corruption, you won't deal with them, then to be honest with you, you won't deal with any multinational in the world because they've all had issues. It's understanding how is the issue that they've had relevant to the situation that we're dealing with, and how do we want to mitigate that risk. So I think, like Deborah has said, technology plays a role, but as humans, we've got to understand it's not the be all or end all. We have to have an active role in that decision-making process. And for us as organizations, as companies, it's making sure that we understand one size does not fit all, right? There's not a standard solution that you can buy off the shelf that will work for your organization. You have to take a level of customization, and you have to balance it with the risk that your organization, the risk appetite that your company has. What is it going to do? Because again, if you're overtly risky, then you're going to have issues. But on the other side, if not taking on any risk, then you're not going to make any money. So again, it's not one size fits all. But that's again where I think as organizations, we've got to really look at what is it that works for our organization and do that element of customization.
Thank you, Jalil. Thank you. Going back to Charles.
Samer, if I may sorry.
Yeah, please, Arkan.
Just quickly, on your question, what could be done, to kind of, let's say, reduce the risk of technology being abused, whether it's by criminal networks, but also, by corrupt individuals. I think one thing is important that Jalil mentioned is the process and governance, segregation of duties, checks and balances. Someone needs, the controls around the decision points. Every process has decision points. So what controls are on decision points? Some of these controls can be technological by nature, but they cannot all be technological in the sense that, we still need a mix of regulatory controls as well as technological controls. Second, the quality of data and data verification. That's very, very important as well to ensure that whatever digital solution we are adopting, that the data, the quality of the data, the verification and validation of data mechanisms are there, because bad data, using a good digital solution, bad data can lead to the wrong decision. And I'm not talking about ideal data. I'm just talking about a certain standard that will allow the process to achieve its goals. Third and last is the privacy and personal data protection. This is very important as well. Regulation is key for that. Again, controls on privacy and personal data protection is the third kind of measure that needs to be considered in order to safeguard or mitigate the risk of abuse of technology. So I just wanted to come back to that question and share these thoughts with you.
Thank you, Arkan.
Can I just build on that as well? Because I think you mentioned a key point there, which is data quality, and I think it's really, really important from a business perspective that everyone understands the critical role data quality plays, because decisions are made on data. And the problem that you have, especially in large organizations, is that whether it's an organization that has grown inorganically through acquisitions, there tend to be multiple systems that has multiple interfaces, and data is not accurate, and data is sometimes used as a basis for a decision, but ultimately it's based on flawed data. And all this, of what we're talking about in terms of digitalization and digitisation, all of those require data to be able to make a decision, and require that kind of logic. So as the old saying goes, if there's bad stuff going in, there's going to be bad stuff coming out of it, and you should not be surprised that is happening. But that is something I think as organizations we sometimes truly do not appreciate the impact bad quality or bad data can have on the decision making.
Thank you, Jalil. Going back to Charles on discussing the conversation around artificial intelligence and the upcoming blockchain technologies and moving towards cashless economies, as well, such as cryptocurrencies and so on. So what do you think are the new tech trends shaping, and how do you see the workforce is being impacted in the near future?
I think a lot of it goes back to that explosion of information problem again, that if we're looking at the sudden growth of cryptocurrencies, there are thousands of them. It's not like having a national currency. You might have thousands of different cryptocurrencies in one country. Do you want to engage with that cryptocurrency? Yes or no? If you do, it opens up a huge amount of information flow. Again, that goes back to to Arkan and Jalil's points just a second ago. It's creating more data. Each little bit of data you're creating is potentially creating an opportunity because it's giving you more information, but equally the more information coming in, that tidal wave of information coming in from blockchain, from crypto, from all these things is going to make it probably harder to make decisions because there's so much more there. Putting artificial intelligence, machine learning into these systems helps. Absolutely, it helps. And I think it can't be a problem to have a machine helping you, but it's still going to come down to, at each stage, a value judgment. And I think Deborah put the point about you can't really let a machine make a value judgment. We were joking on our call last week. I think I've seen Terminator. I know what happens, but you can't really let a machine make a judgment because that machine will judge on just almost binary decision making processes. Whereas there is always a human element to any decision making. There's always do we accept a risk, yes or no? Now you can program a machine and you can program artificial intelligence to make those decisions up to a point. but really it's going to come down to areas of trust. And I think we as a species, not just we as in a region or we as in a profession, but as a species, we're still not at the stage yet where we're ready to let a machine make a decision for us, ultimately. We'll let a machine do some things. So I get in my car and I let the machine decide what speed the windscreen wipers go when it's raining. I'm quite happy with that. But I don't let the car decide when I brake, when I stop to avoid an accident. We're not quite there yet.
Of course. So what important impacts does it create in our lives, Deborah, adding on that?
So it's interesting because I just was chatting with some researchers that did research to actually highlight Charles's point there about what humans are willing to give the level of trust. And so far, humans, even though they know humans have their foibles and their flaws, they still trust humans to make decisions, especially, for instance, in if it's a legal case, etc. So look, it's interesting, right? So we need to kind of look at why corruption happens. And I'm always fascinated as to, the difference between the haves and have-nots, the disparity of wealth. Charles made the point of the explosion of information, but we also have the explosion of disinformation. So there's so much for us to navigate going forward. Look, from my perspective, the future is up for grabs, just but it all depends upon the decisions and actions we take today. If we create a future where we don't design things to ensure there's fairness and equity and no one's left out, then we're going to have huge fallout. And so it can become a very dystopian future. But this is why, I love the SMEs and the entrepreneurs, because regulation isn't actually a negative. And you shouldn't be designing things based on where the regulation is today, because regulation is always 10 steps behind. We need to all think about the future that we want to see, not just in our lifetime, but in future generations. And we need to reverse engineer that and design from that point. We need to challenge ourselves. That there's a great expression by the founder of Lego, and his mantra was only the best will do. And I think we could really embed some of that within our decisions and not just be lazy and lackadaisical. But we have so many resources. And the other thing is, let's move away from the hype and spin that tends to be prevalent in the startup community. Listen and integrate the work from researchers who are doing research on the impact of this in order to help us design things better. We don't have to redesign everything overnight. We can take a breath, take a step, and be considerate of our consequences. I think, personal humble opinion.
And if I could just add to that as well, I think based on what Charles was saying, and about technology, self-driving cars. I think we were talking about this last week, right? Is that where is the technology going today? And there are people that are comfortable to get into their cars today and put it onto self-drive and let the car make the decision on when to brake. And we've heard of issues of these accidents that are happening in the US where people have done that. And again, everyone is different, but is technology that advanced that can make that kind of decision? And are we comfortable with that logic? What is the logic? At the end of the day, the system, the computer is making a calculation. And what is that calculation? And it goes back to earlier what Charles was saying, that, who's going to police the police here? Who determines that the logic that's being developed is the right logic? So again, I think it's back down to what we've all saying is technology is good, it's an enabler, but there has to be some human oversight just to make sure that everyone is aligned with at the end of the day on the outcome that's going to come out.
Well, and in terms of that also, we need to make sure that we're not embedding biases in the algorithms. And there's another critical point about the driverless cars. There's some amazing research by Joanna Bryson, and who's an AI ethicist, and she always says, who's responsible? Because these issues are not to be answered kind of as yes or no. There's such complexity, and there's some extraordinary discussions taking place. And I think the answer comes from cross-pollination. As humans, we tend to think in terms of silos. And I think the solutions for the future actually are cross-disciplinary, multicultural, and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table.
Thank you, Deborah. There's a question as well that's being asked. I'll just cut it short. Maybe like, do you agree that digitization will lead to efficiency and effectiveness, and to a lesser extent in preventing abuse of entrusted power for personal benefits? It's an open question as well. Okay.
It depends on how it's designed. I'll let Arkan answer that one, but design matters.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I saw the question. The question is saying that, well, I mean, it's really more about the quality of the laws and the quality of the people who are interpreting and enforcing the laws. Maybe we can add to that the political commitment. We can add to that cultural aspects related, institutional cultures, and so on. So, I mean, like I said, there is no clear, simplistic relationship of causality between digitalization and anti-corruption. It depends how you design it, how you govern it. The issue of algorithms and how you actually, you know, there's an example in one of the countries that we worked with, is that at customs, the algorithms were manipulated to allow certain goods coming from certain countries to be classified as low risk, and therefore not passing through mandatory inspection, going through the red line instead of the green line. So we've seen examples of actually digitalization helping corruption instead of preventing it. Another example is in the health sector, in terms of managing inventories of medicines and medical equipment, how also because of the quality of data, because of the lack of checks and balances and controls on what data is inputted and how decisions were made on procurement and on management of the supply chain that were favorable for corruption and not the other way around. So again, there's no simplistic relationship of causality between digitalization and anti-corruption, but they are mutually reinforcing if the digital solution is properly designed and properly governed. And that is something that has been said repeatedly today, but there's no harm in re-emphasizing that. And in order to take this idea forward to practice, you need to link the culture of compliance and corporate governance. I don't want to use big words, but basically good leadership, good regulation, you know, not over-regulation, not total deregulation, good regulation, good leadership, good regulation, and then looking at what is the problem that you want to solve, and then designing your digital solution in a way to promote not only, you know, ethics and integrity in the process, which brings us back to principles of transparency, accountability, management of conflicts of interest, segregation of duties, etc., which are the key principles for any anti-corruption system and control mechanism.
There's an extra level of I was listening that came to mind as I was listening to Arkan, because there's what's legal and there's what's ethical, and I think this is where a lot of corruption is actually hidden, and this is where protection for whistleblowers is really important. Yeah.
Well, on that, with the whistleblower, if you look at it from a regulatory standpoint, both in terms of whistleblower regulation worldwide and protection for whistleblowers, and actually encouragement of whistleblowers, there's an increasing harmonization of regulations that more and more countries are coming together to be similar, or as the Singaporeans say, same but different. It's the same but a little different, and that's happening as well on the regulatory and enforcement perspective, anti-bribery and corruption. Each new law that is brought out, so the OECD are pushing very hard for everyone to get that level playing field. So when the French brought out Sapin 2, French anti-corruption law relatively recently, it's that little bit better than what was there before. In the same way as the UK Bribery Act was that little bit better. And we're seeing that every new law that's coming into play is a little bit better at leveling the playing field, at delivering more ethical, better behavior, at protecting whistleblowers, encouraging whistleblowers, and crucially trying to move towards a point where it's not seen as just a checkbox of doing compliance. It's seen as something that's going to help business globally, particularly in emerging markets, emerging economies, particularly for startups. Compliance isn't a bad thing. It's going to help businesses do better business.
And especially if you want to attract international investors that are coming from markets where these issues are even more important, then it's just sound business practice. But there's also some really interesting business opportunities, which are where the harmony is between global corporate governance standards and local customs, and being able to balance those. But we're running out of time, so I can't go into that story, but I'm happy to write about it if that's helpful.
If I could just add something very quickly. I think one word, it's trust. In everything that we're actually talking about, it's a very simple word, but it's a very difficult thing to do. Whether we're talking about technology, whether we're talking about whistleblowing, whether all of these kind of things. And maybe it's a topic for another day, but it's just something for you to all to reflect upon, because without trust, nobody's going to come forward, nobody's going to raise an issue, nobody's going to use technology. So, it's just something for us all to keep in the back of our minds.
Great, amazing. Thank you, Jalil, as well. Thanks for this excellent discussion. If anyone from the audience has any questions, please feel free to send them in. If not, then let's see if we have any more questions. I think we answered 2 of them already. Then I would like to close this session with another polling question, just to go and measure what our audience take away from our panels today. So the question is, given today's discussion, do you still think digitization is a solution to corruption prevention? So no. Can we have the results, please? So actually it's a tie, 50-50. Thank you very much. I would like to thank our panelists for today. And from here, I would pass it through to Rania.
Thank you, Samer, and thank you so much to our esteemed speakers, Jalil, Deborah, Charles, and Arkan, for sharing your wonderful insights, experiences, and also interesting debate. I think that last question was really quite interesting to see the split on 50-50, and the last point that was discussed was this need for trust. Technology can only be a tool used to help things, and this area of trust and how we can create a corporate culture of accountability and transparency through processes, but through culture as well, is really important. And this is something that we at the Pearl Initiative look to explore further in other panel discussions as well as in-person convenings. I hope you, our audience, can walk away with some actionable tips that can help perhaps implement within your own organization or think about implementing in your. So thank you for your commitment and as well as your engagement with us in today's session. In partnership with STC, the Pearl Initiative will continue to be hosting webinars as well as in-person convenings and some research in 2022 onwards on different topics related to anti-corruption, integrity, and that important word trust. We encourage many of you, our audience, to sign up for our newsletter and check out our website, our social medias for additional information. And specifically, I encourage you to register for our end-of-year virtual event on December 15. This event on December 15 does an overview of corporate governance, the state of affairs in the Gulf region over the last decade. You will hear from experts, and there will be fireside chats from representatives and founders of and leads of companies and organizations including OECD, STC, Talabat, Let's Work, as well as government officials from the Gulf region, including the Minister of Youth of Bahrain, speaking on the role of the next generation youth in family businesses and small businesses and startups. This event is designed exclusively for you, the business community, to review the corporate governance journey in the Gulf region, assess the current state of affairs, and align on future key priorities and areas for 2022 and beyond. So we do encourage you to visit our website or reach out to us by email or on social medias to learn more about this upcoming session and others as well in 2021 and onwards. Thank you all once again, and I wish you a safe and healthy day ahead. Have a great day. Bye.